Why don't we maybe step further in time then and speak about regionality? I mean, just sort of a bit further in time. So by regionality, as I understand it from your article, we're basically speaking about the tradition to which you've already alluded, that Uthman had copies of the codex, that is the version of the Quran that he produced, sent to at least 4 different cities. I mean, I think it's been recognized already in classical scholarship and then early in Western scholarship that this wasn't, he didn't have a scanner. And so the versions that he had written down weren't precisely the same. In very minor ways, in a very limited number of ways, but definite ways, there's differences. So does that sound okay? What would you add to that account of the regions?
Yeah, so that's the exact idea, is basically, you create a master copy, and then you make copies of the master copy, and then you sort of distribute them across the empire. And so the first person to make the actually one important piece is in classical works like Al-Muqni' by Ad-Dani and Abu Ubaid's work, Fada al-Quran, and things like that, and Farra. So many early classical works mention or record a number of discrepancies between these codices. And I would say, as far as I'm aware, Noldeke was the first person to realize that the pattern formed by those discrepancies, they actually form a stemma. And so what is a stemma? A stemma is essentially sort of a familiar relationship between texts. So if you imagine, if I produce a document and then I give that document to a number of students and tell them to copy it, in the process of copying, so think about not a photocopy or a Xerox machine, but sort of hand copying, different students might introduce different mistakes, right? So they might not copy it perfectly. And then as students of those students make copies, other mistakes will get introduced, and you can trace the lineage and recreate a family tree, essentially, of the relationship between these codices. So what Noldeke noticed initially is that the list of discrepancies between those ascribed to Medina, Sham, so Syria, Basra, and Kufa form a stemma, while Mecca, the list of variants attributed to Mecca stand out a little bit. They don't quite fit in neatly. Now, what Michael Cook does is he sort of takes them and he's a little more critical, and he basically enumerates all possible stemmas that can be formed by those particular variants. Noldeke had basically suggested that the Medinan copy was the archetype from which the other 3 copies were made. And Cook says, well, we can't really be sure about that. So he kind of refines Noldeke's initial proposal. Now, that's all great based on the literary sources, but the question is, does that actually hold true in the sort of material witnesses that we have in the manuscripts? And so that was sort of the impetus behind my work on the regionality of Quranic codices. Now, other folks like Yassine Dutton and Marijn van Putte, they sort of studied individual manuscripts, and they'd noticed that, and even De Roche in some of his works, they'd noticed that certain manuscripts, they did more or less follow along in terms of their variants with one regional tradition. So like this manuscript, you can say, is by and large Syrian, etc. But nobody had gone through and sort of surveyed all of the available manuscripts that we have, the early manuscripts, and seen if they actually form a stemma. And if they do form a stemma, how does that compare to the one that Noldeke put forth and that Michael Cook refined? And so that's essentially the core of my project. And so what I do is I sort of look at things in 2 different ways. I say, if we take the traditional literature, and I go through and I collect a lot more variants than what Noldeke and Cook use, which they basically relied on Muqni', which has kind of like a summary list. But I go through earlier works and I collect more of them. And I say, okay, this is sort of the list based on and this is actually another important point, is no 2 classical Muslim scholars agree on a list of variants between the different regional masahif, the different regional codices. Some report one or two, some report long lists between those of Iraq and Medina, and it's a mixed bag. And so what I do is I kind of sift through them and I organize them in a structure, and I separate between well-attested ones in the literature and poorly attested ones. And then what I do is I go to those locations in the manuscripts and I collect all of the variants that are found there. And I don't classify, I just kind of collect the raw data. And I use a technique known as phylogenetic analysis. So it's the same way, we can, take your DNA and your children's DNA and your cousin's DNA, and we can kind of reconstruct a family tree without asking you, is this person your parent? Is this person your cousin? Is this person your sibling? We can know that on the basis of mutations or slight variation and shared genetic material between you and other individuals. And of course, this applies at the level of species as well. We can do this with variants in manuscripts too. And so what I show is, if you take the earliest manuscripts and you reconstruct the family tree, so the stemma from it, it essentially reflects more or less identically what we get from the literary sources. Now, there are, the devil is always in the details. There are some very important details that I do highlight in my paper. So I would say the first one is the fact, so I mentioned that no two, classical sources have the same exact lists of variants. Right. And what's very interesting is we can compare some of the variants that are given in those lists with what we find in manuscripts, and we find discrepancies. So it's not a perfect, the actual variants themselves are not a perfect match. And the discrepancies is they allow us to date when those reports were written, or at the very least, what date the manuscripts that were relied on come from, what time period. Because I guess it's important to mention that Qur'anic orthography evolved over time. It got sort of upgraded a little bit. So for example, medial alifs, like the Malik and Malik example we talked about, as sort of time went on, more often you find the medial alif written in manuscripts to sort of make things more explicit. And there are other things with case vowels as well. And what you find is in the earliest manuscripts that we have, certain words were spelled differently than, say, manuscripts that are about a century later from the 2nd century. And so that kind of gives you an idea that, well, these reports probably don't come from the 1st century, from the sort of contemporaneous to the canonization of the text by Uthman. They come from a time period a little bit later. And then by sort of looking at the pattern and how Muslim scholars documented these variants, I sort of infer that knowledge of these variants sort of emerged organically as people traveled and things like that, and they compared their different codices. They sort of became aware of these minor differences and minor discrepancies and started documenting them systematically. And of course, no two copies of a manuscript are perfectly identical. So someone might be looking at maybe a slightly more archaic manuscript and document things a little bit differently than someone else. And also, of course, as diffusion takes place across the empire, what also happens is people start to pick and choose. Like, I really think this other variant is very nice, so let me put it in my manuscript.
So you get something like hybrid
exactly
version.
So you get this contamination, what we would call it. It's not a sort of a loaded term, it's just descriptive. But in the same way, even the Hafs tradition, so Hafs, even so the reading traditions, they don't necessarily follow 100% their regional codices. So Hafs violates sort of, or goes against, deviates from the Kufan manuscript in 2 instances as well. So that allows us to sort of get this landscape of what of sort of the regional codices and sort of the emergence of the traditions that document those variants.
Okay, so I have the big question to ask you about what this means for the coherence of the traditional narrative or its likelihood. But before we get there, could you help us understand how you can look at a manuscript and classify it according to one of the cities, one of the 4 cities? Does that make sense? Because the manuscript doesn't have like a stamp which says, oh, I came from Kufa, Basra, Medina, or Damascus or Hems, depending on which one you choose in Syria, right? So is it just the preponderance of readings that line up with the traditional reports that lead you to identify it? Yeah, and is there a danger of circularity there?
That's a great question. So there are, for example, in my paper and Cook and Noldika, we have sort of lists, tables that contain sort of the regional variants. So the specific ones that are found in the Medinan Mus'haf, I would say the Himsi Mus'haf, the Kufan and the Basran. And of course, those aren't the only regional mushaf that are out there. There's also a Meccan mushaf and potentially others that we don't know about. So again, in the traditional reports, you sometimes you get mention of mushafs that were sent to Bahrain and Yemen and things like that as well. And we don't have any witnesses to those texts, so we can't speak of them, which is why I say at least 4 codices. Now the Meccan one, so we do have lists of variants for the Meccan codex. What's interesting about the Meccan codex is based on the variants that are given, it's a hybrid codex. So it is sort of dependent on at least 2 of the 4 codices we mentioned. So it's not that it's impossible that certainly a Meccan codex at some point existed because there was a Meccan reading tradition. But the question is, was it sort of an original? Or was it a sort of a descendant, a child of those 4 manuscripts? And the way I see it, based on the analysis of the variants, it's dependent on at least 2 of the 4 original archetypal codices. So
to be hyper clear about this, just because a manuscript today is located in Damascus, for example, or Cairo, or well, maybe Cairo is a bad example, or Medina, doesn't mean that it's from that particular not reading tradition, but that particular stemma of the regional codices.
That's an excellent point. Thanks for bringing it up, actually. So now when we use the term regional, does this, this manuscript belong to a specific, have a specific regionality? I like to think of regionality as sort of from as a text type or a subtext type. So there is the, you can say, and I sort of give them designations like that in my paper, but you can talk about the B text type or the Basran text type, the K text type, the Kufan, the M text type, the Medinan, and the S text type, the Syrian, and C, the Meccan text type. So solely sort of in terms of a classification of the manuscripts. Of course, manuscripts are very mobile. And as I mentioned, clearly knowledge of these variants diffused across the empire pretty quickly. And so there's nothing that demands someone writing copying a manuscript in Damascus must have chosen to copy the Syrian one along with the Syrian variants.
Yeah, maybe a simple point, but just in case it's helpful for some of the viewers. You alluded to other traditions which have additional amsar. By the way, amsar is the word which means something like military garrison city in the context of the Islamic conquest. So these cities, Kuf and Basra are classical examples of them, but Damascus might be included, even though that's an ancient city, of settlements that were established during the conquest in which early Muslims settled. Related, by the way, to the Arabic word for Egypt, Misr. We have these other reports. I believe Yaqubi, for example, includes a tradition that Bahrain, at least Bahrain, maybe Yemen, are mentioned, but that's not to be taken seriously, it sounds like, because we don't actually have within the literature coherent lists of variants attributed to that Misr, that city.
Yeah, that's a good observation. So I think the earliest person to mention Bahrain and Yemen is actually Abu Hythem al-Sijistani. So he's also a 3rd century Hijri scholar. So the way I like to think about it is and it does bring up the question of, like, not all reports are created alike. So you can't, look at every report and take it at face value and weight it the same and say, well, there was a report that mentioned 7 cities, one that mentions 5, etc. And that's something I do a little bit of in my paper. So a couple of points to make. So number one, from a sort of a historical critical perspective, if we want to reconstruct what happens from material evidence, what we have are manuscripts. And we can only go as far as the manuscripts allow us to go. And the manuscripts simply do not admit more than 4 archetypal codices, right? So that's the key point. So whether or not a manuscript, certainly we have manuscripts recovered from Sana'a, Yemen, which you alluded to earlier in the conversation. So there were Qur'ans in Yemen. I'm sure there were in Bahrain. But how do they relate? Did Uthman order copies to be made? Were they part of the original copies? Perhaps he sent some originally to the garrison cities. As you mentioned, by the way, Hims was a major garrison city early on, prior to the rise of Damascus, which I think I do mention, and it sort of plays into why I think that Uthman sent the Mus'haf to Hims as opposed to Damascus. But also, so that's the important question, which is a historical one, right? And if one is to rely on the material evidence, then it only points to at least four, at least to which all the manuscripts I have studied and basically have access to go back to. But the other aspect is we don't have lists of variants of the Bahrain Quran or of the Yemen one, but we do of the Meccan one. And what's very interesting, and this is that the earliest reports we have, so we have one in Kitab al-Masahif that goes back to Hamza Zayyat, so he's one of the 7 and the 10 canonical readers, and we have Al-Dani. So even though Al-Dani, I'll put it this way, even though Al-Dani documents variants from 5 regional codices, he insists, including Mecca, right, he insists there are only 4 that Uthman sent. And so I think that speaks, and he says that this is the opinion of the majority of the scholars of his time. I think Pace, Abu Hythem as-Sijistani, who kind of stands out. And so to me, that along with sort of the report from Hamza and other factors allow me to sort of say that the reports that do mention 7, and even later on, so much later on, more people seem to converge towards 5. They don't carry as much weight as the report that mentioned 4.
Okay, right. And so then, I mean, the big question and the exciting question is what this says for the tradition of the Uthmanic canonization of the Quran. Obviously, it suggests that there's credibility in the story. I mean, is that your basic assessment? Are there still questions to be resolved, or maybe elements of your research which point to different perspectives on that story?
Yeah, so I think that the sort of the broad outlines of the story seem credible, because we can study manuscripts independently. We find that it admits 4 archetypal codices, that also agrees with what early scholars seem to highlight about the number of mushafs that Uthman sent out, and other explicit reports. But so the devil is in the details, right? So the question now is, how did those codices diffuse to the rest of the empire? How was the Rasm read in those regions? So for example, you send a manuscript to Kufa, where there's the Ibn Mas'ud tradition is very popular. How do the people there receive the text? How do they interpret it? How do they read it? And how does that manifest in the qira'at, in the reading traditions? So I think really a very important area of investigation, which I'm working on right now, is how does the oral and the written, how do the two of those interact? The thing is, the way I like to put it is there's sort of an event horizon. Oftentimes in Islamic studies, at least using sort of historical critical methodologies, where prior, sort of the turn of the century is as far back as we can look, using traditional methods. And in order to go further back, you kind of have to get creative.
You mean the year 700, basically? Yeah,
just about. Yeah, around 700. And if we want to look further on in the past, we have to sort of adopt non-traditional approaches, if you will. And this is where I like to bring in my background in math and statistics to help us get a window into the sort of the very formative years of the formation of the Uthmanic tradition.